I want to bring back David Rohde, Laura Barron Lopez, and Ayman Mohyeldin. All right, so what I heard there from Scott Bessent was we have expectation of cooperation, but we do not have any promises or guarantee of cooperation. Is that what you heard?
That's what I heard. And the thing I'm looking for is oil. That's, if we're talking about economic strangulation of Iran, it's going to be oil. It talks about digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, but the last one is shipping. And if you look at the specific firms they're going after in terms of shipping, there's a Syrian national, there's a reference to someone based in the UAE, a Ukrainian, actually, a Singapore-based firm. There's no efforts to go after these Chinese companies, China proper, that, again, buys 90% of Iran's oil exports. So it seems like they're blinking when it comes to China.
Seems pretty toothless.
It seems toothless because one of the most interesting things in that press conference was the first question, which was specifically about China. I think for a lot of people who are observing how China has managed to evade sanctions or to survive to some extent over the past several years, it has been through China, which, as David rightfully pointed out, buys anywhere between 80 to 90% of oil. If you're going to impose economic sanctions on Iran, the real question is, can you get China to comply with those sanctions? And if so, to what extent will the U.S. be willing to force China into compliance with these sanctions, knowing that China could retaliate against the United States however it wants to economically? David's point is important because he's pointing out individuals and small level companies that are doing the work on behalf of China. That's not going to change Chinese behavior. And so when the question was asked to Scott Bessent, will the U.S. impose these sanctions on Chinese banks? Will they pick up the phone and call the Chinese government and say, we need you to comply with this? There was no clear answer. He just kind of said vaguely, the president is having his phone calls. We'll find out more in the timeline. There's a timeline, but we won't tell you what that timeline is. And for us who've been covering this story for years, it's very different than JCPOA in 2015, in which the United States entered into a negotiation with Iran, but brought along all of the European allies to say, we want to commit to this process. If Iran doesn't comply, will you participate in these sanctions? The Europeans said yes. The Russians said yes. The Chinese, to some extent, said yes. And so they were able to get the Iranians into the JCPOA agreement. This time around, it's not clear that the United States is going to leverage these sanctions against China, more so than against Iran, into compliance.
Why now?
Why now? I mean, what options are left to the administration at this point? Because there are so many of the president's allies and those inside the White House and Republicans in Congress who will say, if he wanted to move the needle, he would go in more forcefully. There would be boots on the ground. He would make the case to the American public, mind you, which he hasn't done really at any point since he started the war and we're entering the 6th month, but would make the case to the American public why he believes that military force on the ground is necessary to make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon and that we get the enriched uranium, which you don't really hear them talking about as much anymore at all. But why now? Because what other options? I mean, they did try economic sanctions in April, and back then, Scott Bessent talked about those as the financial equivalent of a bombing campaign. So used just as harsh terms back in April when trying to describe those sanctions that they were imposing on entities that they said were working with Iran. But one thing that sticks out to me from what's announced today, which is just playing off of what David was saying, is that they single out shipping as one of the actions that they're taking in terms of companies or individuals or entities that are trying to ship through the Strait of Hormuz or abiding by potential toll payments to the Iranians. Does that mean the blockade is not working? Because, again, the president over and over again keeps saying that we have control of the strait, that this blockade is working. He has said, not just this past month, not just in June, but all the way back in April, that Iran's economy was collapsing. And yet they're saying that they need to do this now in order to further collapse Iran's economy.
Well, none of this has been internally consistent.
No, and not to go back, but I was glad Ayman said this, like, the old-fashioned idea of an international coalition, like it's what George H.W. Bush did after the invasion of Kuwait. It's what was done with the JCPOA to actually have the Chinese and Russians on board. But this administration has done everything on its own. It's alienated the Europeans. I mean, it's horrible what Iran is doing to its people, and they do not have a legal right to take over the Strait of Hormuz. It's an international waterway. A more traditional approach, it may not sound as exciting in American politics, is to get a coalition of nations saying you cannot stop traffic through this waterway. You could have Japan be part of that, South Korea be part of that, UK, France, all these countries need that energy. But we missed that chance months ago.
Here's what I could not stop thinking about as Bassem was talking, Eamon, which is the idea here is economic isolation of Iran or any other party who chooses to continue trade and economic activity with Iran. Sort of a reminder that the United States in some ways has actually isolated itself, that he could not come out today and say, here we are with our partners who we have agreed upon the path forward. The cheese sort of stood alone today.
Yeah, and I think the Iranians know that, right? I think the Iranians know that America is isolated and they don't have a lot of buy-in from European and China in enforcing what this war has been about. And I think if you follow what's happening inside Iran, the Iranians are talking from a position of strength. The Iranian president has come out and said it is time for us to end this war, meaning like they believe they're in the driver's seat of how this war is playing out. And I think it speaks volumes to how the Iranians have internalized these measures that the Americans take. To Laura's point, this is an act of desperation by the United States because the military operation to collapse the regime or change its behavior failed. That hasn't happened, right? So you're going almost back in time to use a more blunt weapon more than the lethal weapon, right? The most lethal weapon that you had was the war, and you killed the Iranian regime. You tried to take out its upper echelon of decision makers. Now you're trying to go into a system to shape their behavior in which they have already withstood the hardest part of your arsenal. So the Iranian government looks at it from a position of, we can withstand the military might. We have withstood the economic might for decades. We are firmly in the driver's seat with how we are driving up oil prices and creating this havoc for our allies in the region, the Arab Gulf allies. So they now feel that they can begin to enter into these negotiations on their terms. And I think it's very different than what the United States perceives to be, as Scott Bessent was describing, D-Day.
And just a reminder that Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to be at the White House next month. So again, while the president didn't really pressure him on Iran or the war or getting help from them when he was there in May in Beijing, which I was at that trip, and Iran was basically not talked about at all in any significant way. Is he going to pressure Xi Jinping when he comes next month to the White House at all?
And what is he willing to offer President Xi in exchange for Chinese cooperation, right? Because we may be trying to win this war with Iran, but we may be hurting our national security interests in a very different arena because we don't know how President Trump negotiates. He may very well say something to President Xi that gets President Xi to say, okay, I'll cooperate with you a little bit on Iran, but maybe we want something in exchange when it comes to Taiwan. Maybe we want something in exchange when it comes to access to American markets, the auto industry. Who knows, right? Because this is how President Trump operates in this very kind of murky and shadowy world of negotiations. And it's not clear what President Trump's main priorities are.
You get the last word.
No long-term strategy. It's back and forth. Right. We've lost 5 to 6 months in these negotiations with the president threatening this and that. And this is just the same thing. I don't think Secretary Bessent said the word China. I'm not sure. Our colleagues in the room asked great questions. That's astonishing. I mean, do we fear Beijing that much from a president who promised to make the United States strong and respected around the world?
David Rohde, Eamon Mohideen, Laura Barron Lopez, thank you all so much for getting us started.